Alright. Now, some of you may remember that I got cut off the last time I was doing my stream because I managed to blow the power supply on my computer system. Hopefully that won't happen again. So I'm going to be playing a little bit of Space Engineers, but at the same time, I'm also going to be trying to continue my conversation about why I feel that the TIE Fighter is a often neglected, but also extremely important part of the Star Wars mythos, and the fact that it pretty much, in all reality, outclasses and outperforms all, and I do mean all, of the existing Star Wars starfighters. I know that seems rather strange to say, considering the TIE Fighter is relegated to the absolute worst position in Star Wars of being unshielded, generally regarded as a cheap and disposable throwaway starfighter. So, I think the first thing I'm going to do is address the idea of it being unshielded. Now, a lot of people go, well, since it doesn't have shields, it's terrible, because every weapon in Star Wars will destroy it. That's fair. There's no arguing that, I mean, you get shot by a weapon in Star Wars, you're gonna die. Unless you have, like, the hero powers. Then you get a free pass. So, when it comes to the TIE Fighter, it being unshielded, actually, yes, I use actually, is not a disadvantage. I actually modified my TIE Fighter from the last time I did this. Once the textures load, it's going to look a little bit different from the last time. Be nice if I could actually see what I'm doing. But in order for that to happen, I've got to wait for it to load. Okay, finally loaded. Now, when it comes to the TIE Fighter as a whole, it is, for all intents and purposes, a fairly bad starfighter. Except, when you actually consider it, it's not. The TIE Fighter is considerably faster than a X-Wing. Considerably so. To the point where there's almost no real comparison between the two. So what does that even mean? Well, when it comes into a conflict or any kind of engagement, there's a very old expression that can be easily applied here. You can't kill what you can't hit. And an X-Wing cannot hit a TIE Fighter under normal circumstances. The TIE Fighter's mobility, general agility, and overall performance so far outclass the X-Wing that without dumb luck or the will of the Force, you've got no chance of hitting anything. You're basically just firing blanks. So, the question becomes, why do you need shields if the whole idea is don't get shot in the first place? And what exactly do the shields accomplish? Considering that the whole idea of the TIE Fighter is, it is supposed to be piloted by individuals whose whole idea is they get behind the enemy and strike them where they are weakest. In other words, the place where they cannot defend themselves. Strike from the rear. TIE Fighter pilots are trained to engage their opponents academically. You know, the same way our pilots are trained. They go to the flight academy, they learn how to fly their craft and various tactics for dealing with their opponents. X-Wing pilots, in the beginning at least, were not given that training. Most of them were leftovers from the Clone Wars. Oftentimes being little better than militia pilots and various rogue pilots, former separatists, and assorted other things. Now, the irony is, most separatists didn't know how to fight Eton fighters either, because most of them were droids. So, when it comes down to it, the TIE Fighter is actually perfectly designed for what it does, in fact, do. Which is to engage and defeat enemy fighter craft. When it comes to that, the TIE Fighter is, in essence, the best in class. There are almost no other starfighters in the entirety of Star Wars that are competitively capable of defeating it. But the X-Wing beats it all the time. Well, technically it doesn't. I mean, if you ever watched Star Wars, you'd realize that the X-Wing gets regularly massacred by these things. Yeah, that X-Wing. You know, the one that is generally touted as the best starfighter in Star Wars, to the point where it was literally forcibly used in the new movies because it was so iconic and capable. Even though, and I mean, literally the TIE Fighter was just given an undergun turret and they called it a day. I mean, the new Star Wars movies were just terrible, but, I mean, at least they tried. That's all I can give them. They tried. Now, when it comes to the TIE Fighter being faster than an X-Wing, more maneuverable than an X-Wing, more capable than an X-Wing, it becomes pretty dynamically obvious that in a one-to-one fight between a TIE Fighter and an X-Wing, the TIE Fighter is going to win. I mean, that's like saying, if you take a World War II Me-262 and pit it against an F-22 Raptor, somehow the Me-262 is going to win. because it's not. This is one of the biggest problems that a lot of people have when it comes to Star Wars. They get it in their head that, oh, well, the TIE Fighter is terrible because the X-Wing is just better in every single way. But when you look at it, the X-Wing is obsolete, out of date, slow, has basically a torpedo launcher, which in a fighter battle does absolutely nothing. I mean, it truly does nothing, because they never are going to be able to fire that torpedo and actually hit something other than out of sheer luck. Whereas the TIE Fighter is equipped with just enough firepower to kill any fighter that it encounters, and for all intents and purposes is fast, maneuverable, and capable of killing any starfighter it comes up against. The X-Wing is not. The X-Wing is actually very limited in what it is capable of killing. I mean, technically, in all reality, it can't even really kill a capital ship, because if it doesn't hit the right spot, that X-Wing's torpedo is going to do absolutely nothing. Just straight up nothing. It doesn't do anything. We often overestimate, and by extension underestimate, the TIE Fighter, not because the TIE Fighter is a bad craft, but because for all intents and purposes we have been led to believe that there is just no way the TIE Fighter can be good. This is because, for all intents and purposes, it has to be bad in order for the good guys to win. You have to make the bad guys look bad. Because if the bad guys look good, then people are going to wonder how it is the good guys won. And that's kind of where we run into our main problem here. For all intents and purposes, the good guys should not be able to win against the TIE Fighter. But they are, and they regularly do. This is because, despite everything about the TIE Fighter is always fighting outnumbered and outgunned. You look at Star Wars, at no point is the TIE Fighter ever fighting opponents with superior numbers. The Rebellion is always using more fighters, quote-unquote, better fighters in the form of the X-Wing, so forth and so on. It's an endless cycle of, well, how are you supposed to beat these things? Honestly, I'm kind of just rambling at this point. So, back on topic. Does the TIE Fighter need shields? No. If it gets behind an opponent, it doesn't need shields. Because the whole point is, once it gets behind the opponent, that opponent is defeated. They're just dead. Not only that, but if you look at Star Wars directly, the shields do nothing. They occasionally protect the pilot from a critical failure. But overall, in a dogfight, the shields have repeatedly and continuously shown to be completely and utterly useless. They do nothing to protect the pilot or the starfighter in general. The shields are useless. Shielding a starfighter is useless. Anything that hits that starfighter will go through those shields because the shield generators are too small to effectively block it. Unless it is an extremely lightweight weapon. The only thing that a shielded starfighter will protect them from is basically a handheld blaster. It will not protect them from other starfighters. It will not protect them from other weapon systems. It does nothing. The whole advantage of the X-Wing's shields is a moot point. it's not even a real defense. Because the TIE fighters' weapons go right through it. The Star Destroyer's weapons, they don't even really have point defenses. They just have so many guns that they can saturate the area with fire, and eventually they'll hit something, or at least they hope they will. And when one of those rounds hits a starfighter of any kind, well, that starfighter just explodes. So the whole point of, oh, well, the X-Wing has shields, therefore it's better because the pilot has a higher chance of surviving, is a moot point. It doesn't actually work. The moment that pilot gets hit by any weapon, they're basically already defeated. So giving it shields does not protect it. This is something that has been around forever, but everyone seems to just kind of blow it off with a case of, well, the shields are able to protect the pilot. No, they're not. All throughout the entirety of Star Wars, we see fighters getting knocked out by TIE fighters and cannons. The shields did nothing to protect them. But they extend the life of the starfighter because it can survive 1 or 2 hits. You know what else can survive 1 or 2 hits? A TIE fighter. You know how? By not getting hit. That's the point. The TIE fighter, its whole job is to not get hit. As in, you don't want this to get shot. The whole thing about X-Wings having shield is really just a lie created by the Rebellion to convince the pilots of the Rebellion to literally, suicidally throw themselves at the opposition. Yeah, suicidally. You heard me. The X-Wing, the pilots are not treated with respect. They are not treated with valor. They are literally just thrown into the conflict to be ground up by TIE fighters until such a point as they engage or kill the enemy. And the idea that the TIE fighter pilots are like mad dogs charging the enemy and throwing themselves into the conflict, that's stupid. That entire comment it's just stupid. TIE fighter pilots are trained combat pilots. Trained combat pilots. They are quite literally given the same kind of academic training as any other skilled combat pilot. So the idea that they suicidally throw themselves at the enemy makes no sense from any perspective. You don't teach your pilots to commit suicide when their whole job is to protect the bigger ship they're on. Because if that bigger ship dies, so too do the pilots. So this entire argument becomes a moot point. Because for all intents and purposes, you're just literally telling us that TIE pilots commit suicide. Which is, quite frankly, not the case. Because TIE pilots don't want to die either. And it would be really foolish for the Empire to essentially train their pilots to commit suicide, because then they can't do their job. You know, the important one, protecting their starship so that it doesn't die. The idea that they would basically just be... I mean, really, the people who would be committing the Mad Dog tactics are in fact the rebellion, because that's the only way they can win. The only way an X-Wing can defeat a TIE fighter is in a head-to-head fight. Again, relying on the concept that its shields will protect it. Even when they don't. Even when it's suicidal. The rebellion would be teaching its pilots to basically commit suicide because they are fighting against an enemy that they cannot beat any other way. Whereas the Empire would be doing everything it can to keep its pilots alive, because a living pilot can go on to fight more enemies. Plus, a lot of those pilots would be related to individuals in the Imperial lineage, I guess you could call it. And as such, they would need to protect them and keep them alive in order to justify their various actions. Because as long as they've got those pilots alive, they're capable of at least doing something. I need to rebuild this. But if you get all of your pilots killed constantly, they can't do anything. Anyway, back to the subject at hand, the TIE Fighter. I'm going to keep going off on these rants. Another thing that came to mind is the fact anyone who has played Mass Effect, yes, I'm bringing in Mass Effect into this conversation, knows that it is actually really, really hard to find something flying in space. Especially when it produces very, very little power. A craft that is incredibly hard to detect because it produces very little power, thereby making it a stealth fighter. A stealth TIE fighter. The TIE fighter produces very little power output. It doesn't have shields. It doesn't have a hyperdrive. It doesn't have a droid. It basically just has these large solar panels which absorb energy, not reflect it. So what you have here is a craft that has large panels that absorb energy, produces very little energy, thus making this extremely small, extremely fast, extremely agile craft nearly completely undetectable. Huh. Now, isn't that a thing? When you think of that, suddenly I'd rather be in a TIE fighter than an X-Wing, because I'm going to be hard to detect, I'm going to be extremely fast, I'm going to be extremely agile, my weapons will kill just about anything I'm up against, and the entire state of my craft's function is entirely reliant on my individual skill. So it oddly makes sense that the TIE Fighter is is built the way it is. Unlike the X-Wing, which in all reality would have a ridiculously high energy output. Meaning, despite everything, the X-Wing would basically be a glowing beacon in space. Yeah, you heard that. The X-Wing is a glowing beacon. Easily detected, easily identified, and extremely easily dealt with. Unlike the TIE Fighter, which is extremely difficult to detect, very capable, and extremely difficult to deal with. These factors re-evaluate the TIE Fighter from being a trash starfighter to being one of the best designed starfighters in Star Wars. The X-Wing, despite everything, has its weapons focused extremely far on the edge, meaning they have to angle them inward in order to hit anything. Yes, it's got 4 of them, but here's the thing. Did it ever need 4? That's the real question. Does the number of weapons actually matter? I mean, we have the TIE Interceptor, which basically has 4 weapons. It's designed to go up against the X-Wing. But when you factor that in, there's actually no benefit to having 4 weapons. 2 weapons do the job. They do the job better. And, I mean, you could just put bigger weapons if you want better power. So, for one thing, the TIE Uglies don't really make any sense. They're kind of dumb. On top of that, you already have a starfighter that is better than its competition. Putting a medium turbo laser on it only helps if your whole plan is to, engage, like, light capital ships like frigates and stuff. That you just have a swarm of TIE fighters. And for that purpose, you could literally just take out these guns and strap a bigger gun onto the bottom. You wouldn't need to build those ridiculous TIE Uglies. Those things are terrible. And they should be ashamed for making them. Especially when you have a perfectly good TIE fighter here that does all of that, only better. I mean, for all intents and purposes, you could just cut the wing off, strap a bigger gun in between the wing and the chassis here, and there you go. You've got a fighter with a really big gun that can still use it the same as these. There's no reason to, strap it on the other side over here. That doesn't serve any purpose. It looks really dumb, because the pilot can't even see the weapon they're firing. It's like, oh, I sure hope it's pointed in the right direction, because I'm over here, and this is all I see. All I see is this. I don't see anything. I mean, even if you've got a targeting system, like a camera on the other side of this wing, so you can see what you're doing. The simple point is, why would you ever do that? It makes no sense. I mean, even if you were to somehow just say the idea of, oh, well, it's so they could put a big gun with its own power supply. You can just put that big gun right here. bolt it to the existing structure. You'd have it dangling down as a Wang cannon. You don't need to build a completely different, bizarre, freakish chassis. And why not just put one on both sides? It really doesn't make any sense. That thing just does not make sense. It's stupid. I can justify anything on the TIE Fighter but the TIE Uglies. Those just make no sense whatsoever. They're dumb. I mean, I can even justify the TIE Bomber and the TIE Interceptor. Those at least make sense. The TIE Fighter makes the most sense. The TIE Bomber kinda makes sense. I'll discuss the TIE Bomber in a completely different video, because I've got some things to say about this thing too. But when it comes down to it, the TIE Fighter is already perfectly built for what it does. And in fact, of all the starfighters in Star Wars, there really isn't anything that competes with it in terms of capability and viability. Well, what do I mean by capability and viability? Well, what about the droid starfighter? The droid starfighter is terrible because it basically, while it is smaller and more agile, the problem with the droid starfighter is it's also really, really stupid. The droid starfighter does not have the capabilities of a TIE pilot to adapt and learn from new situations. I mean, even if we go with the idea that the droid brains in Star Wars are hyper advanced and can do all this shenanigans that makes them able to learn and adapt as they grow, the biggest problem with that is you need the space to store all that information, and it has to be able to call upon it in a way that functionally is doable. That's the best way I can phrase it right now. My brain's not exactly at full peak efficiency. But the long and short of it is, the TIE Fighter can outperform the X-Wing in spades. Design-wise, it's highly functional. The thing about the solar panels is, solar panels are designed to absorb solar rays, solar radiation, whatever you want to call it. That's what they're designed to do. But this is Star Wars. Star Wars has technologies we've never even imagined. These things could be hyper efficient to absorb any form of energy. Any form of energy. Radar, sonar, plasma, any kind of, I guess you could call it ambient energy, anything that would be used to, I guess you'd say, track the target or project it in a wave or things like that, as long as it's not concentrated. They wouldn't be able to absorb concentrated energy. Like, I mean, yes, you can absorb solar radiation, but if you get hit by a solar flare, you're dead. That would basically just be how the TIE Fighter works. If you are transmitting energy, the solar panels will absorb it. If it gets hit by a direct, high-yield energy source like a laser or something similar, they will not absorb it. Which makes it even harder to detect one, because all of the conventional logical methods for detecting it don't work. And because of that, the TIE Fighter is in reality a stealth fighter, even with these giant panels on the side. Unlike the X-Wing, which basically is producing such a huge energy signature that you can see it from across the star system, because it basically is like a glowing ball of energy coming straight at you. The X-Wing is literally just a massive ball of energy compared to the TIE Fighter. Because you've got your shield generators going, you've got your engines going, you've got your hyperdrive, you've got your droid, you've got your life support system. That's another thing that TIE Fighters don't have. They don't have a life support system. That life support system matters. Because, again, it is another thing producing energy. And we are quick to forget that. Now that looks like a TIE Fighter, don't you think? So, when it comes down to it, the TIE Fighter does what it is designed to do extremely well. Something that the X-Wing, the Y-Wing, and really up until the A-Wing cannot compete with it. The A-Wing is the only Rebel starfighter capable of competing with a TIE Fighter in a one-to-one basis. And eventually, even the TIE Interceptor. Now, if we factor in the idea that the TIE Interceptor also uses a similar, I guess you can call it jamming system, where it absorbs all the energy into the wing panels as opposed to the rest of it, this thing would also be extremely difficult to detect, even with its enhanced firepower and speed. But most people aren't going to accept my version of the events because they're going to say, well, you're just an Imperial apologist. No, I'm not an Imperial apologist. Matter of fact, I think the Empire were idiots. That hasn't changed. Empire were idiots. No, what I'm apologizing for is the fact that nobody seems to understand that despite everything, the Empire actually had some good ideas. It's just that unfortunately, those good ideas were buried under the weight of incredibly stupid people. You know, just like everything else in the world. I mean, look, I'm just going to come out and say it. Nazi Germany had some really good tank ideas. The only problem is, those tank ideas were made by people who were, let's be blunt, idiots. I mean, I'm not going to try and apologize for what Nazi Germany did. They were terrible, terrible people. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that their tanks were... That doesn't mean that I don't think their tanks weren't cool. I mean, the Tiger tank is one of my favorite tanks. Just because the people who built it were stupid doesn't mean the design is stupid. I know that's kind of hypocritical to say, but it's nonetheless true. Just because something was designed by people who were, well, basically idiots, doesn't make the design itself stupid. Just means that it was designed by people who weren't too terribly bright. More precisely, people who were obsessed with the wrong ideals. And yes, I did say wrong ideals. Anyway, I'm getting completely off topic again. So, I'll bring it back down a notch and get back to the subject at hand. For all intents and purposes, the TIE Fighter does exactly what's on the tin. It is a fighter designed to engage enemy fighters. And that's kind of it. I mean, you can be as cutesy as you want with it, but overall, TIE Fighter is basically basically a here's what's on the tin, here's what it does. Nothing else. And that actually is okay. That's perfectly fine. I don't know why people are obsessed with trying to decorate it with, well, this is a good fighter, this is a bad fighter. The TIE Fighter was terrible because insert reason here. And in reality, they are just spouting stuff because they read it in a book somewhere and that book said it was bad. Now, they're not necessarily wrong. Like I said, the TIE Fighter, and by extension, then the TIE Interceptor, are what's on the tin. Aircraft that the Empire built for the exclusive purpose of trying to defeat and intimidate pretty much everyone. The Empire were not good people. Everyone knows this. By definition, they were tyrants. But that doesn't mean Kuwait Drive Yards suddenly didn't know how to build a starship. That doesn't mean that the Empire suddenly cannot figure out how space travel works. Just because they're not intelligent, or just because they're being led by idiots, doesn't mean the people who build these things are idiots. I know that seems strange. But it's nonetheless true. The TIE TIE fighter, not a bad craft. The X-Wing, got bad news for you. X-Wing, not actually very good. Kinda sucked, actually. It's not as good as we like to pretend it is. It's got way more issues than we like to think about. I don't know what's wrong here. Is the torque too low? Yeah, torque was too low. Now, let's face it, these people have been building starfighters since before pretty much any character in the series was born. So the idea that they would suddenly not be able to build one just because, well, Empire bad, doesn't really make any sense. And doesn't fit with any of the logic of the TV series or movies. Now, you may think that I'm just nitpicking things and trying to present the idea that, well, the TIE fighter is better than what I thought it was. Just because, well, that's just my opinion. And you'd be right. This is just my opinion. Nothing in this relates to you or your ideas. I mean, I'm not supported by Star Wars. Lucasfilm didn't give me any money to make this. They're not going to give me any money to make this. Heck, more than likely, I'll probably get sued for making this if they actually brought anything to the table. Because, I'm talking about their precious copyrighted IP. I have no rights to speak of this matter. Yay. Don't actually care. This is just fan theories anyway. I'm not obligated to accept their version of the storyline any more than they are obligated to collaborate or accept my version. In my opinion, no one has to agree with me on this, but in my opinion, the TIE fighter is the best starfighter in Star Wars. It has speed, maneuverability, stealth, yet to be proven, but still there, firepower, and even cost. Now, if you were to ask me about, okay, well, with these giant wing panels, you can't see anything. So, okay, let's go back to one of my previous statements. It is really, really hard to see anything in space. Let me repeat that. It is really, really hard to see anything in space. I mean, this is a 600-meter long starship. This is basically what you would be seeing at 900 meters away. That is basically all you would be able to see of the TIE fighter at basically 900 meters away. That's what you would be seeing. If that thing was moving around, flying through space, you've got dozens of directions, you're just trying to see what's going on, you'd never see that. You'd never be able to find it. And right now, I am within its firing range. If it had a functional targeting system that could hit me from this distance, or at least could fire from this distance, it'd be shooting me. So, what I'm trying to say is, in space, being able to see around you does absolutely nothing. The only way you would be able to detect that starfighter would be with a sensor package. And if these massive solar panels on the side can detect or deflect your sensor package, you're not going to know that that TIE fighter's there. You're literally just going to be flying blind. Until that TIE fighter is right on top of you and is shooting at you, you would be accomplishing nothing. You'd be effectively dealing with a myth. Is there a TIE fighter there? I don't know. How am I supposed to know? Well, is it shooting at you? If the answer is yes, there's a TIE fighter there. If the answer is no, there's not a TIE fighter there. That's it. That's pretty much the only way you'd be able to detect one. Now, there is another method of detecting craft in space that is not regularly mentioned, but is still available, and that is communications. The TIE fighter has to be in constant contact with its command ship, has to know where it needs to be, where its allies are, where its enemies are, because it does not have an advanced targeting computer. So all of that information would have to be constantly transmitted to the TIE fighter by the command ship. So basically, the command ship would be the strength and weakness of the TIE fighter, which is what the Empire wanted. They wanted the TIE fighters to be intrinsically linked to their command ships. They did not want TIE fighter pilots flying off into deep space, punching their hyperdrive and going off on adventures. This is not an adventuring craft. This is a starfighter. Its purpose is to protect the main ship. But they don't do that very well. Actually, they do it very well. Luke Skywalker was the only one who was able to fire to basically fire the kill shot against the Death Star. None of the other starfighters succeeded. And in the end, out of all the starfighters you see flying against the Death Star in the first conflict, 3 make it back. Of those craft that were killed, over half died to TIE fighters. Over half of the X-Wings and Y-Wings introduced to us in Star Wars were killed by this, recognized as the worst starfighter in Star Wars. That's a bit of a problem. Especially when you're going to say, this is a terrible craft. So bad, why does it work so well? I mean, this is just the thing that always bugs me about these kind of things. You've got people sitting there going, well, this is terrible, this is good, this is bad. And all of that can change in a matter of seconds. One revelation, if it was revealed that the TIE fighter actually does have what amounts to the equivalency of stealth capabilities for operating in space, at least, not in atmosphere. In atmosphere, the TIE fighter is a terrible craft because you have to fight with gravity, you have to fight with drag, you have to fight with everything. It's slower, it's less agile. In atmosphere, an X-Wing is a better craft. In space, a TIE fighter is a better craft. That is the distinction most people try and ignore. Why? I don't know. They just do. For a lot of people, the idea that the TIE fighter could potentially be good is an insult. And they just refuse to accept it because that would go against their precious X-Wing. How dare I state such blasphemy? In reality, the TIE fighter was just better than the X-Wing. But it sucked against the A-Wing, because the A-Wing was a better fighter. It still was very easy to detect, unlike the TIE fighter. But it was faster than the TIE fighter, more maneuverable than the TIE fighter, had more firepower than the TIE fighter. So it actually beats the TIE fighter in every category, even in defense. Because the TIE fighter loses its only advantage, which is its speed and maneuverability. As soon as it loses that, this thing essentially becomes a paperweight. It cannot function. The TIE fighter has to be better than its opponent to succeed. So what did they build to compete with the A-Wing? The TIE Interceptor. Does everything a TIE fighter does, better. That makes sense. Sitting there and then trying to say that, oh, well, the A-Wing came before the X-Wing. If that was the case, why would they ever need the X-Wing? The A-Wing's better than the X-Wing in every single way. Why would you build something other than A-Wings? I mean, for all intents and purposes, the X-Wing is a terrible craft to use in dogfights. It's not a dogfighter, it's a fighter-bomber. It's designed to be mediocre at everything so that it can be good at nothing, really. But so that it can be versatile and functional. The idea of the X-Wing is not to dominate every battlefield, but to be just good enough that it can remain competitive against any opponent. The TIE Fighter is a special craft designed to be only good against one thing. People seem to forget that. Especially when they make shorts where they have TIE Fighters taking out command ships, like Corellian corvettes. You would use a TIE bomber for that. TIE Fighters are not good enough to take out enemy ships. They don't deal enough damage with their little dinky lasers. They would be able to potentially destroy defensive positions to clear the path for TIE bombers, but they would not be engaging capital ships in any measurable way or function. The best you could hope for would be to use one to damage it so that it makes the bombing run from the TIE bombers easier. That's it. That's all you would get out of it. There is no other benefit. I mean, the only other thing you could do is basically just strap missile launchers to it. Or torpedo launchers, whatever you want to call them. That would be the only way to improve the TIE Fighter and make it capable of engaging capital ships. And even then, you've got the TIE Bomber. Why would you waste the resources strapping torpedo launchers to your TIE Fighter? Because if the TIE Fighter is attacking capital ships, it is not protecting your capital ship, which is what its job is. Also, in relation to space engineers, could you please make a metal plate for this window slot? The 3-point metal plate. We need one. I do not want to keep using windows for this, or trying to put in full plates here. I want the armor plate. Thank you. Now, that aside, with everything else to be considered about the TIE Fighter, TIE Bomber, and everything else about the Empire's design philosophy, the TIE Fighter actually makes the most sense. Of all the craft the Empire built, the TIE Fighter is their best contribution. The TIE Bomber is... I'll discuss that later. The TIE Interceptor is over-engineered. I mean, if you put the same engine in the TIE Interceptor in the TIE Fighter, you'd basically just have a better TIE Fighter that would do the exact same job. Technically, that's what happened in the new movies. They just built better TIE Fighters instead of using better TIE Fighters. They strapped a turret to this thing. This thing is a terrible craft to use with a turret. It defeats the whole freaking purpose. Do not put a turret on your TIE Fighters. It's a terrible idea. You're just going to wind up shooting your own wings. And like I said, equipping it with shields and all that, and a hyperdrive and all that other stuff, defeats the whole purpose of the TIE Fighter. If you're not going to build the TIE Fighter to the specifications of a TIE Fighter, don't build a TIE Fighter. I think I'm getting a little too invested in this conversation. Anyway, as far as my concerns for the TIE Fighter go, I think it is, in fact, one of the best engineered craft in Star Wars. For all the flaws of the craft, it does the job it was designed to do. That is more than you can say for anything else. The Y-Wing makes no sense to me. It's a terrible craft. I don't know where the bombs are on that thing. Clearly it can't carry very many, unless they're about the size of a hand grenade. And if you're just going to be dropping hand grenades on your opponent, you don't need a Y-Wing for that. You could fit the same amount in an X-Wing's torpedo hold and just have them drop out of the bottom of an X-Wing. The Y-Wing makes no sense to me. The TIE Fighter at least makes sense when you remove all the hype and all of the propaganda. These are not swarm fighters, they are designed for ace pilots. They have a singular purpose, which is to intercept and engage enemy starfighters. They are not designed to fight capital ships. They are not designed to engage in planetary warfare. This is a dedicated fighter craft. Yes, it can strafe ground targets. It's not designed to, but it can. I mean, basically the argument could be said, if you're using your fighter to attack things on the ground, you are using your fighter wrong. In my opinion, that applies to the TIE Fighter as well. If you are using a TIE Fighter to attack things on the ground, you are using your TIE Fighter wrong. It's not designed for that. It's designed to engage enemy starfighters in space. And anyone who says differently, look, I know what these Star Wars warfare books say. I've watched Generation Tech, I've watched Eckhart's Ladder, I've watched the shows that discuss these things. In my opinion, they are wrong. There is nothing in Star Wars that indicates that the TIE Fighter was designed to be a swarm fighter, because the whole concept of the swarm fighter, the very title itself, swarm fighter, is a falsehood. Fighter craft are expensive, difficult to maintain, difficult to replace. Using them, just throwing them at a target and hoping for the best, is not a method of winning a fight. The droid starfighter is the only swarm fighter in Star Wars, and that is because that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to be a swarm fighter, to be expendable. TIE fighters are not designed to be expendable. Inexpensive, yes. Expendable, no. The Empire basically training its pilots to be suicidal is... You don't train your pilots to be suicidal. You train them to not get themselves killed. The Empire needed their pilots to be intimidating. They needed them to be terrifying, which means they needed them to be very skilled. They needed them to dominate the competition. If they couldn't do that, they wouldn't have been Imperial pilots. That is my stance on the TIE Fighter. You can tell me I'm wrong, you can debate me on it, you can say whatever you like. In all honesty, my opinion's not really going to change, no matter what you tell me, because this is just how I think. I look at the TIE Fighter, and I think of all the things that it could be. I think of all the ways you could use this effectively. not all the ways that we are shown in Star Wars, because we are not shown anything in Star Wars. The few instances we get to see starfighters in Star Wars is at the end of the Empire's existence, when the Empire is basically already losing. The rise of Luke Skywalker is the end of the Empire. That's just the way it is. Even though they built their new starships, their new TIE fighter, their new TIE interceptors, and all this other stuff at the end of the conflict, that doesn't help when you're already losing. If you're already on the back foot, you're not going to be able to just turn it around because you say so. Well, I think I've done a long enough rant on this. If you want to add anything to it, talk to me in the comments. I'll probably have more to say later. So that's pretty much it. TIE Fighter good, X-Wing kind of bad. But again, that's just in my opinion. You don't have to believe my opinion. You don't have to follow my opinion. I don't follow the opinion of the people who have said the TIE Fighter is insert this here. If I could rewrite the Book of Warfare or whatever they're using to dictate the stats of the TIE Fighter, I'd do it in a heartbeat. I would vastly raise the abilities of the TIE Fighter. Because in my opinion, that's just what the Empire would build.